he's actually kind of mixed it with annual ryegrass and seeded them together. And he said that the crabgrass generally doesn't come up till the soil gets warm enough anyway.
Okay. So even right now, Chris, somebody might be doing that. Right. And then, okay, so that's another. So you could go early. The crabgrass is dormant till the soil warms up. But you could wait until into April that things get really good and dry and seed the crabgrass still. And your ryegrass, it wouldn't be any point in seeding that when you get into April because it's too hot.
If the crabgrass is already there, when do you want to level it?
Just when you get a chance.
Just when it dries out enough to do it. Yeah, yeah.
Can the crabgrass be broadcast?
Well, if you seed it now, I think it would. Now, the rates that you seed, Chris, the normal rates are what? 5 pounds per acre?
Yeah, 4 to 6 pounds per acre.
Okay, if you're seeding it now and they're going back on there and they're mucking it up still, you might want to go with a little higher rate because it won't be as good as if you seeded it in middle of May or into May when the soil warms up and you're going into a nice seed bed. You know you're going to get a better establishment because it's a tiny seed, so you don't want it very deep, but you do want it covered with soil. But if you want to restore a permanent pasture, you could buy the improved varieties of tall fescue. You could try to get them out there. Hopefully you get them seeded by middle of March, into March. The problem is the ground being such that you can get on that ground to do the seeding. So in my mind, the best thing is actually if you want to say, I really want a very good permanent pasture, think about what do I need to be doing now in this summer, getting ready to do a seeding in late August, early September, because that's when you're going to get the best establishment of permanent pasture. So maybe that area you've been feeding, you know there's some weed problems. You can do some spraying of those weed problems over summer. You could seed a summer annual. I mean, it might be a crabgrass, but if you're going to go back to a permanent pasture of fescue and clover, then it's probably going to be something like a sorghum Sudan grass, some type of summer annual like that. If you are going to seed in the spring with a permanent pasture mix, it's not a good a chance of success because often it gets hot before those plants are very big. Then again, the earlier the better that you get it out on the ground. You know, the goal would be trying to get it seeded mid-March to end of March. But once you get into April, you can still seed alfalfa. You could even still seed red clover because they're more tolerant to heat. But if you put fescue in middle of April, it's by the time it germinates and grows, it's going to be too hot. And you say, well, people seed their yards later, but you've got sprinklers for yards, or you've got hay you can put on there. I mean, maybe a feeding area, you've got enough straw there that you'd be okay to put it, or you can throw some straw out there. But on a big pasture, that's hard to do. And then, I mean, the last thing is if you've got an area that's not just pure mud, you still see little flakes of grass there, then just resting it, not putting animals out there can make a big difference. But I'm not just talking about waiting an extra week or two before you put animals out there. I'm talking about maybe you're not really getting out there and grazing until June. Maybe you have to even mow it a time or two, or you cut it for hay, and you let those plants. It's all dug up right now, but you let those plants start producing new tillers and filling out a little bit before you put the animals on there. Now, we've got an excellent publication, and you all don't know it, but this is actually an excellent publication on establishing small ruminant pastures. Now, you got to do a little work on this, though, with your pencil. That's why Tom gave you a pencil, because you got to mark out horse, and you got to put small ruminant. You got to mark out the picture, and you got to cut out one of the goat or sheep pictures from one of our pubs and tape it on here. We should convert this, but this is our best establishing pasture publication. And actually, pastures don't really care who's grazing them. So if it bothers you that we got horse in here, then just go through it there and mark out horse and put small ruminants. And actually, all the advice here that we've got, even the mixtures and blends we talk about, are going to fit perfect for small ruminants as well as horses. We've got a little higher seeding rate here because we figure the average horse owner's got a lot of extra money on their hands, and so they can go a little higher seeding rate. It never hurts to add extra seed. It just costs you a bit more. If you're seeding the lawn, the recommended rates are actually 200 to 300 pounds per acre. So it doesn't hurt to put a little extra seed as long as you feel like you can justify it. On small areas, I'd go ahead and, particularly broadcast seeding, I might put 40 or 50 pounds of fescue. But 20 pounds is enough as long as you do it right and you give it enough time to get some growth on it. Okay. Now, Tom, I've just got an hour-long presentation. Is that going to work? Tom and I and Gene Olson have a meeting every Monday morning, and I was looking back through my text messages, and I've got a long string of messages that go to Tom and Gene, and it says, I'll be there in 5 more minutes. I'll be there in 10 more minutes. So I don't follow his advice that he gave his kids. I'm always a little bit on the late side, but I promise you're going to get to lunch on time today. Okay, Tom asked me to talk about grazing managements, and I've titled this From Basics to Practice. And rather than do a lot of work talking about laying out the system, where you put the fences and stuff, Tom, we've got a rotational grazing pub here, I think. This gives you more detail on actually where you put the fence and how you put it. I'm going to talk more about the principles of taking care of the plants. Take a minute to look through this calendar. Chris and Jimmy and I are real proud of it because we put a lot of work into it. Now, I'm sorry that it's not getting to you until February. We just got it from the printer about a week ago. But it really gives a number of good practical tips month by month what you need to do that time of the year. So if you say, well, I don't need a calendar, I would say just put this up on the wall on your shop door or something like that, just to remind you of the kind of things you need to be doing with grazing management, with pasture management during the year. Jimmy took a lot of these pictures. Did we get some small ruminants in here? Okay, you might need to again cut out some pictures from your publication and tape them on here. But the pastures don't know what's grazing them, so it's going to still fit. We're going to have to work on that for the next edition. Yeah. Our UK forage website, the way I get to it, even though I know what the URL is, I just Google KY forages. So we've got upcoming events. These tiles, each one of them, if you went here to establishment, you'd see about 30 publications relating to establishing different forages. If you go here to variety trials, you get all our current trials. We've got events. We've also got our forage news, which is a monthly publication, just updates relating to forage management. You can sign up and get that monthly. If you sign up for the Chris's YouTube channel, that would just, when there's new YouTubes, like from this meeting, that come up, it'll send you a reminder. You can just go to the YouTube channel by yourself. You don't have to sign up, but that's a good way to get reminders. And I particularly want to mention this, since we've got one of these in Lexington. April 9th, and in other dates, different parts of the state, Chris has organized a fencing school. So it's a whole day event, teaching you some basics of fencing in the morning inside, but then in the afternoon, you're going to be outside actually building fence. And one of the things that's really unique, in our 2-day grazing schools, we talk a lot about temporary fencing, single-strand electric wire, but here you're going to put up a high-tensile woven wire fence, some really new technology, really good fencing material, so it would be something that would do very well with sheep and goats. I'm really excited about you all coming to the fencing school in Lexington because we need a really good fence to separate some very high-priced research that I've been told animals cannot get into from where we're going to be grazing, and you guys are going to put up that fence about 500 feet right down through there. We're limiting this to 30 people, so you get a lot of hands-on. So if this is of interest to you or you know someone else, then get them to go to the website and sign up for that right away. I about forgot. This is funded by the Ag Development Fund gives to the Master Grazer program. That also helped fund the calendar, and that's supporting this and giving this to you at a subsidized cost. Anything else, Chris, I should mention on these events? Okay. If this year doesn't work, we'll continue to have these throughout the coming years. This is that Kentucky Forage YouTube channel. I just Googled KY Forage's YouTube. And you've got recent presentations, but you can go back a number of years, even when Chris was at Virginia Tech, and you can find particular talks on grazing by small ruminants at different presentations. Okay, this is someone I worked with when I was at Virginia Tech in the early 2000s. You probably recognize J.C. Winstead, Chris. This is his hillside farm right in the western part of Virginia, actually west of Blacksburg. This is an orchard grass clover field, but this is the main reason I'm showing you. Okay, this is J.C.'s farm. This is the neighbor's farm. When he came to the farm 25 years ago, his looked like the one on the right. Grown up, these are both pasture land way back when, but they had been allowed to grow up into multiflora rows and locusts and all kind of stuff. This is the advantage of grazing management. Now, JC did a little bit of bulldozer work for some of the really big stuff, but he's kept it this way, even though he's had all kind of seed coming over from his neighbor by good grazing management. So, some basics. What does a plant need to grow back? What does the plant need? It needs roots to take up water. What else does it need? It needs sunlight. Okay, but the plant needs something besides just sunlight. It needs leaves. It needs good soil as well. You've got to have the leaves to take up the sunlight so that you can have photosynthesis, so you can have energy produced and the plant will grow and it'll produce energy for the animal who's eating it. So the energy comes from the leaf area that's remaining, because that's what's taking up the sunlight, the stored carbohydrates in the plant material, and I'll talk more about the carbohydrate storage in a second. So just really simply, photosynthesis is the process where light energy from the sun is being converted into chemical energy. So, it's really a neat system. Carbon dioxide from the air plus water from the ground in the presence of light, the chloroplast in the plants, that's the green part of the plant where the chlorophyll is contained. You've got sugar produced, you've got oxygen given off. We wouldn't be here on Earth if this didn't happen. We've got the oxygen to breathe, we've got the sugar, and then more complex carbohydrates that come out of that for us to consume, for animals to consume. This is really the basis of life on Earth, is how the sun energy moves into us. But I digress there. Think about plants. Think about your pasture. This isn't going to happen. If you graze really close, then you're not going to have photosynthesis, at least for a little period of time. The only way the plants are going to grow back, Tom, can I borrow one of your demo plants? The plants aren't going to grow back. The way they're going to grow back if it's grazed to the ground, or you're coming out of a hard winter and there's no green growth, is by carbohydrates that are at the base of the stem or down in the roots. But eventually those are going to get depleted. So maintaining leaf area is critical. You could plant things like warm season grasses, and they're very efficient at photosynthesis in the summer months, but obviously there's a little bit of effort in planting those, because something like sorghum sudan grass has to be replanted every year. Okay, think about the plants we have in pastures in Kentucky, particularly the three on the left: Kentucky bluegrass, orchard grass, tall fescue. I'm trying to be real careful, Tom, that I don't give away what any of these plants are, since this is a contest. So usually I'm telling you what I'm showing you. Okay, if you're grazing close, and obviously small ruminants have the ability to graze close, if you're grazing close with Kentucky bluegrass, then there's still some leaves below even a grazing height that's less than 2 inches. So you've still got photosynthesis happen even at close grazing. If you get a plant like orchard grass that's more upright type plant, then you get down to 2 inches or less than 2 inches, you're taking off pretty well all the leaves. The plant does have carbohydrates stored here to grow back, but eventually that will be depleted. So orchard grass is very sensitive to close grazing. Bluegrass can handle it. It would still rather have more leaves. It would grow back faster, but it can handle it. Fescue's in between. It's able to maintain some leaf area below a close grazing height, so it can tolerate close grazing, but still there'll be some limitations on the amount of growth. Bermuda grass can handle close grazing as well, but it's not, we don't have real long hot periods through the summer, so it can be an option, but we don't have as long of a season as they do further south. So we don't spend a lot of time promoting this being planted, but these are the main base in most of our pastures. A way that Dr. Gary Bates at University of Tennessee has described it is if you take phase 1 of a plant growth, and this would be what's happening when our grasses are growing back in the spring, not many leaves, there's not much leaf area, so there's not much sunlight being absorbed. New growth has to come from energy stored right at the base of the plant. Slow regrowth after grazing. So that's phase 1. Slow growth. We know that in the spring. Phase 2, there's high leaf area. There's a fast growth rate because there's a lot of leaves. The plants can take up a lot of sunlight. They're young and they're efficient with photosynthesis. They've got a high photosynthetic rate. We get a fast growth period. We move into mature plants, phase 3, high leaf area. So you say, well, there's got to be a lot of photosynthesis. But the leaves are older. They're not as efficient with photosynthesis. The plant's also putting energy into producing the seed head. From a quality standpoint, that's lower quality. But from a plant growth standpoint, that's not really helping you. You want green leaves. So that's another reason to keep plants at a leafy stage so that when they're grazed, they grow back quickly, but you don't graze them too close so that they do grow back quickly. Now, we've often make the comment that it's important to maintain good root systems in grasses. Actually, let me go through this slide, and then I'll follow up on something I want to explain with grasses. You graze close and you graze frequently or continuously, you deplete the carbohydrates needed for top growth. Here, this plant that's been grazed repeatedly really close, you've got some regrowth. It's high quality, but there's not much of it. Obviously, if you've got less roots, you've got less drought tolerance, less nutrient uptake. Just on average, grasses lose about 30% of their root system every year. Now, that's a good thing in that root system, as it dies off, goes in the summer when it's hot, when the winter, when the plant's not growing, it's going into building up organic matter in the soil. But you want to make sure you're taking care of those plants when there's good growing conditions so that 30% that's lost is actually replenished by the new roots that are growing. And so in a system like this, where you're never letting there be much leaf area, every year 30% dies off, another 30% dies off, you end up with a very shallow root system. Whereas plants that are rotationally grazed, this is one that's never grazed, that's not what we want, but one that's rotationally grazed, you replenish that root system and you've got a good deep root system. You've got better drought tolerance going into the summer, you've got better use of your nutrients because you've got a bigger area that nutrients are being taken up from. So what you end up with, if your grazing is too frequent or too close to the ground, or you've got a lot of areas that are spot grazed, you've got not much top growth, so weed seeds fall and germinate. You've got not much root growth, so when those weed seeds like a tall ironweed or like a thistle, when it germinates and the root gets some depth on it, it's got all the water and nutrients it needs, so no wonder it can flourish. So you might say, well, there's weeds, I need to spray, I need to kill them with a herbicide. Sure, you need to do that, but if you don't take care of the pasture or do some overseeding to fill in, then weeds are just going to come back and they're again going to have, they're going to flourish because of the pruned back root system and the thin top growth. Now I've got a video clip on the website. It's not working on Chris's computer. You can get to it on our website under Decision Aid, but I'll show you the response with a couple of pictures. These were 2 orchard grass plants. We know orchard grass is a desirable forage, highly palatable, very nutritious. But as I showed you earlier, orchard grass is a plant that if you take it down too close, you're taking off a lot of the leaf area. These two plants were taken out of the greenhouse, much like what the plants that Tom has over here. They were in excellent health. No difference between the two. This one was clipped to 1 inch tall at the beginning of the month. This one was clipped to 3.5 inches tall. Then this one was clipped every week down to this 1 inch tall for the rest of the month. This one was rested, kind of like we're rotationally grazing. So we're resting it for a month or for a 4-week period of time. And then we're letting it grow back. So the only difference was the closer clipping or simulated grazing and the fact that we came back every week. Now, if an animal finds a good grass that it really likes, is it going to come back to that area and graze it again? So this is kind of what's going to naturally happen in the field. So this is what happened at the end of the month when we let both plants grow back after 6 days. Which pasture would you rather have? One on the left, the one on the right. Okay, no question about it that, I mean, it's just amazing the amount of growth coming back. Okay, the reason for that was part of it we clipped close so we didn't have as much carbohydrates in the base to grow back. But the plant did okay the very first week or two. But then we didn't allow enough leaf area to replenish the reserves down in the base of the plant. Grass plants, their roots are fibrous. They can't really store much carbohydrates down under the soil in the roots. They're storing their carbohydrates right here at the base of the stems. So to give a rest period, you know, there's advantage to giving rest periods for parasite control, but there's huge advantages in the grass growth, in the productivity in pastures. Now, what about tall fescue and orchard grass? It actually took, when we did the same little demonstration with tall fescue, it was the 3rd month before we started seeing a big difference in the regrowth between the rotational and the continuous, because fescue can maintain some carbohydrates down close to the ground. But most of us have a mixture in our pastures. We have orchard grass, we have fescue, or we want to get more orchard grass, so we drill it in the fall into that fescue pasture. If you take that mixed pasture and you're rotationally grazing it, you're not going too close, you're giving it a month of rest. Here, I'll show you, again, this video clip is on our website, but here's the difference in 6 days. Orchard grass on the left, tall fescue on the right. Orchard grass with a rest period has tremendous regrowth potential. It can grow back faster than fescue. Now, I'm not saying that orchard grass is going to overtake your fescue field, but it's going to be to stay in that fescue field if you're giving it that rest period. Okay, with legumes, we've got taprooted legumes like alfalfa, red clover, Sericea lespedeza would fall into this. In fact, Chris, I guess you'd say that even the annual lespedeza would be more of a taprooted type plant. The white clover, either the Dutch type or the Ladino type, their root system is a bit more like a grass, a bit more of a fibrous type root system. So these plants can store carbohydrates in the roots, so they could be cut or grazed right to the ground, and they're going to have plenty of reserves to come back. You just got to make sure that the height of grazing or cutting doesn't matter so much. You just need to give a rest period to replenish the reserves in the root system. So here's the ideal situation. You've got red clover, you've got Sericea, you've got alfalfa. You're giving it a good period of growth, because carbohydrates drop at the beginning. In fact, they can be 30 to 40%. The weight of the root is sugar and starch. Drops during that initial regrowth because that's going into top growth, but it builds back up. So we talk about letting a legume get to a point that you start seeing some buds or maybe even early bloom. We talk about that particularly with hay cutting, but even with grazing, that rest period allows it to replenish the carbohydrates in the roots, and then the plant, we've got good yield, but we've also allowed for good regrowth and good stand length. Frequent grazing in a taprooted legume, the carbohydrates are not able to build back up. The stand gets thinner and thinner. You try to get red clover into a pasture, even a good red clover varieties will survive for 3 years, but if you're not giving some rest periods, they're not going to go nearly that long. So in a mixed stand where you've got grasses and you've got legumes, particularly these taprooted type legumes, then alfalfa, red clover, sericea is going to dominate at a low cutting height as long as you give it a rest period, because it's got the carbohydrates in the roots. You're not so worried about the leaf area. The grass can dominate in a sward where there's a high cutting height. Actually not, typically we're talking not just 3 inches, we're talking even 4 inches or more, because it has all that leaf area for sunlight to come back. So low cutting can favor, or grazing can favor plants more dependent on root carbohydrates, as long as they're given a rest period. High cutting height favors plants more dependent on leaf area for regrowth. So in your pocket guide, if you haven't used one of these pocket guides before, I encourage you to look through it. But there's a grazing section here, and it talks about different heights. Page 40, actually, it's page, not 40, it's page 37. So it talks about the ideal height to start grazing different forages, the ideal height to stop grazing. Orchard grass 3 to 6 inches, so you're leaving that leaf area so it can come back quicker, giving it a rest of 15 to 30 days. The taprooted legume like alfalfa, you give it 30 days of rest, at least 25 to 30. You could even give it longer to be able to grow back. Things like the summer annuals, whether it's sorghum Sudan grass or pearl millet, they need to be left even taller to get a good regrowth coming back. Okay, let's say you've got a 50-acre farm and the animals have access to that whole area. And there's a pond in the middle. You haven't put in the watering system like Chris talked about. Where are the animals going to spend a fair bit of time? Near the pond? Maybe around the shade trees? Okay, even if you forget all the regrowth things I talked about, where are a lot of your nutrients going to end up? Near the pond, or in the pond, or around the shade trees. So grazing does a great job of recycling nutrients through the urine and through the manure, but if you end up concentrating all that manure and urine in the pond, around the pond, near the trees, then you're actually under-fertilizing these areas, over-fertilizing those areas, contaminating the water, plus the fact that you're not getting as good of regrowth from your plants because maybe this whole area here around the shade in the pond is overgrazed, this is undergrazed. So how many paddocks do I need to make before I can start using some of these rotational grazing practices that I just talked about, helping the plants grow? How many do I need to make? How many splits should I put? Okay. Well, that would depend some, but really the answer I was looking at is, a lot of people say, well, all the things you've talked about in the short grazing time and the long rest interval, I've got to go with 6 or 8 paddocks before I can get these benefits. If you can just split a field or pasture in 2, even better if you can fence out the pond and have a water tank, you're starting to see some of the benefits. Particularly if a lot of what you have growing is things like Kentucky bluegrass and tall fescue and white clover. Those will tolerate that closer grazing. So maybe you're on this side for 20 days, you're on this side for 20 days. The plants are tolerating it. They're not giving their top yield, but they're giving an improved yield. You've got better grazing management. You've got better manure distribution. Maybe you've got a rented farm. You say, I can't afford to do a lot of fencing, or I don't have much flexibility with the water. Just some simple splits can make a huge difference. Obviously, the more you go to, the better, the more options that you've got. But don't say, well, I can't do all of these splits, so I'm not even going to bother. Just get started where you can. So a good guide or good recommendation is that grasses, you leave some leaves, provides energy for regrowth, even though it can look like you're being wasteful. Good rule of thumb is to graze that favor the legume. Grazing low favors the legume. Grazing high favors the grass. Now, white clover can handle either of these because it's kind of in between. But definitely with the taprooted legumes, this fits. Regrowth interval, the rest interval becomes very important for that carbohydrate cycling that I've talked about. So plants that can tolerate continuous or frequent grazing are tall fescue, bluegrass, white clover, Bermuda grass. They're still going to respond to rest periods, but they can handle it. Moderate grazing intervals, maybe you're only able to rest for 15, 20 days. Orchard grass and red clover will tolerate that, though they would rather have a little longer rest interval. Rotational grazing is required, is essential for alfalfa, native warm season grasses, brome grass, sorghum sudan grass. Okay, I'm okay still with time? Okay, I went through that because I wanted to add one little piece more of information. Have you all had a speaker talking about the benefits of red clover from a medicinal standpoint in the animal, giving better weight gains and reducing the fescue toxicity? Okay, so let me just give you a quick update because actually a fair bit of this research was done with goats. So there's a video and you've got the publication showing the improved varieties. But I'm going to talk more specifically about why plant clovers into your pastures. The USDA lab at the University of Kentucky, it's called the Forage Animal Livestock Production Unit, I think. They've done a lot of work, a lot of very practical work in forage management, a lot of real basic work in the laboratory. But Michael Flythe, one of the researchers there, was seeing that red clover was promoted with some medicinal benefits. Now, these websites are where you can go buy red clover as a human supplement. But he started realizing there's actually some things in the medical literature about the compounds in red clover that can be beneficial in human diets. And so he got to thinking, well, what about in animal diets? And so one example or one problem that we have in ruminant animals, a real good thing that we have is we've got all these little bacteria that attach to the fibrous compounds, and they break down those fibrous compounds, and we can take these grasses and convert them into protein in meat, in milk, in our small ruminants, in our large ruminants, and we're not having to feed them concentrates all the time like we have to with chickens or pigs. So it's these little bacteria that are doing the work for us. But you've got a whole bunch of different types of bacteria. There's some that are beneficial. Michael likes to compare them to good forages. There's also bacteria that he likes to classify as weeds. These particular bacteria are called hyperammonium-producing bacteria. So they're breaking down the protein, and they're breaking it down into ammonia, which can be taken up to the bloodstream and converted to urea, and then is excreted through urine, which I guess fertilizes the pasture, but it doesn't get down to the small intestine where you want the protein to be so that the animal can gain some weight and produce some milk. So it's a wasteful process to have what we call these bad bacteria, these hyperammonium-producing bacteria. Now, you can take a product, I don't think it's actually registered with small ruminants, Rumensin. Am I right? I don't think you can use it, but let's say that you could use it. You can? Okay. Okay. So, but my point now is not recommending that or not recommending it, but a product like Rumensin is an antibiotic growth promoter. It doesn't have the same antibiotic compounds something like the penicillin type products does, but it'll kill out those bad or those hyperammonium type bacteria. That's one of the reasons that it can increase weight gain. So those type of growth promoters, they've been criticized, they've been regulated. Do you really need to use them? Is there, anyway, what are the restrictions? So the lab there said, what ways can we find growth promoters from plants? And actually in hops, there's some growth promoters that are naturally occurring that knock out these hyperammonium-producing bacteria, allow the forage to, in essence, you get more weight gain and more milk production because you don't have those wasteful bacteria. But they found that in red clover, going back to that medical research, that there's a whole group of compounds called isoflavones. They're phytoestrogens, so they have an estrogenic-like material. That's why you don't want to feed a whole bunch of red clover to use when you're trying to breed them, because it can be kind of like a natural birth control, and you don't want birth control when you're trying to get breeding happen. But let me tell you the benefits of it. So I'm telling you, there's a little bit of warning with a bunch of red clover on a ewe that you're trying to breed. But one particular isoflavone is called biocanin A. And it acts like that rumensin. It inhibits the hyperammonium-producing bacteria. And this is work in goats that they were doing there at the University of Kentucky, the USDA lab. The biocanin A, they've shown in goats that it reduced the ammonia production with different amounts. And these upper amounts are kind of what you would have if you were feeding a diet of about 1/3 red clover, or you had about 1/3 clover in pasture, 2/3 grass. Here's where they the clover extract. So and this is in steers. So they haven't done as much weight gain work with goats, but they, like I say, they have done the work where they actually showed the benefit to knocking back those wasteful bacteria. Feeding just distillers grain, they got an increase in production, but an even greater increase where they added that biocanin extract, or in essence had equivalent red clover. White clover also has some of these same isoflavones, but only about 1/3 the amount that you have in red clover. A really good article explaining what they've done is in Hay and Forage Grower, February 2017. So if you Googled even just this title, you might need to add the Hay and Forage Grower. You could get this article that explains this really in a pretty good, easy way to read. If anybody wants to, I could send you the research articles that go into this. So that's one benefit of red clover. Now, what's the problem with fescue? What's the problem with animals grazing Kentucky 31 tall fescue? Okay, there's an endophyte in the plant that helps the plant survive, helps that turf grass survive, but produces toxin, particularly the ergot toxins or the ergovaline. So it causes vasodilation of the vessels, which can lead to heat stress in summer, can lead to frostbite in winter by not getting blood flow out to the extremities, less weight gain, lower reproduction. So fescue is great as a grass, but can cause some issues with animals. We've long said to add clover to fescue so that you dilute the amount of fescue so that you get better gain because it's higher quality. But until this work was coming out, we didn't realize that clover, particularly red clover, has some advantages over just the dilution fact on fescue. So both that reduction of those bad bacteria, but another really neat thing, and this is the kind of, when I talk about vasoconstriction, animals being fed a tall fescue extract from the seed that has high levels of these toxins, it's constricting blood vessels. These are little slices of blood vessels that they're putting the compound on. And so here's the regular vessel. Here it's constricted from the toxins in tall fescue. But work that they've done with goats there at the University of Kentucky, here's what it looked like when they were feeding tall fescue, and that's the blood vessel. This is with ultrasound, so it's an intact animal. They're not having to take the veins out and slice them up. Here's when they were feeding about 1/3 ration of red clover mixed in with fescue. And you can see definite vasodilation. Here's also work with the goats where here's what was happening to the vessels. They were 50% less than normal as far as constriction. When they started feeding that, they still were feeding the toxins in the fescue seed, but they were adding red clover or adding extract from red clover. And they got the blood vessel back in just a few period of days. These are days back to normal levels. This is cattle work, but the similar type of thing what's happening where you got vasoconstriction, grazing, endophyte infected tall fescue. Here's when there was 1/3 red clover, 2/3 infected tall fescue. It didn't bring it back completely to normal, but it caused a fair bit of dilation. So just to summarize this work, research is indicating that the biocanin A is a growth promoter, can also relieve ergot alkaloid or tall fescue alkaloid-induced vasoconstriction. More research needs to be done to find out just how much is in other legumes, like white clover, alfalfa. Just preliminarily, white clover is about 1/3. Alfalfa, we think, is probably about the same. Okay, but for this audience, make sure you pay attention to this last comment. This research is focused on growth and not reproduction. I read an article that Michael sent me, and if you feed only red clover versus grass, then red clover that was dry, like in hay, dropped. Well, the reproductive efficiency was 190%, so meaning there's a lot of twins and some triplets in sheep being fed total red. The 190 was with grass alone. It was 165 reproduction success when they were fed red clover that was dry as hay. And this is 3 weeks prior to breeding and several weeks after breeding. When they were fed red clover in a fresh material, but again, it was 100%. The reproductive success was 100%. So what I'm saying is those phytoestrogens, if you're feeding large amounts of red clover, can have some effects on sheep. We really don't have much literature with goats. With cattle, there's some worry about that, but in a similar study with cattle, they weren't seeing any effect. So with sheep, breeding animals, you'd want to watch out. With growing animals or milk-producing animals, after they've delivered, then red clover can have a real benefit. Okay, I've gone over a lot, but I wanted to cover the mud, wanted to cover the talk Tom gave me, and I thought it'd be nice to throw in this extra work since that has been work directly with small ruminants. Tom, can I answer a question or two? Okay. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
Is it very hard to get started, or can you go in and no-till it?
You can no-till in. It'd be the same thing with clover. You'd like to have it grazed close. You'd like to have a little bare ground showing. And usually you're not, when you first look at it, you're going to say, I didn't have any success because it kind of comes on slow. But we've done it with spring seeding. We've also done it with late summer seeding. It's not as easy as getting clover in. But I know several dairy producers that have been putting it in. But again, you'd want to try to knock back the competition of the grass. Even after you've seeded it, maybe do another grazing a few weeks later when the chicory is just starting to come up to kind of knock back that competition. Yeah.
Not a question, but just kind of anecdotal on what you're saying about affecting the reproduction rate.
Okay.
We had some alfalfa that was kind of playing out, but it was still probably half alfalfa.
Mm-hmm.
So last summer we grazed our ewes on it. Normally we would expect maybe 150 to 175 lambs in the fall.
Okay.
We had about 35. And Dr. Ely
Wow.
thinks it's due to the effects on the alfalfa.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, so that is the one caution with legumes. Red clover would have the highest levels, but as I said, you can have it in alfalfa and white clover as well. Now, I don't.
Scientific study that's the reason, but that's what he thinks.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm interested in trying bale grazing in the winter.
Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I've got a pasture now that I thought I would like to maybe interseed or add some seed. So it would be better to do something. I want to use it next winter
Mm-hmm.
with the bales on it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to add a little seed. I thought about trying to add some now versus adding some in the fall.
So good question, and since I'm recording, I'll repeat the question. So he's asking about, he's going to do some bale grazing next fall. He wants to get the stand thickened up a bit. Is it better to seed things like fescue you're talking about? Yeah, okay. So to get the best chance of a long-term permanent pasture, late summer, early fall, late August, early September is the best time to seed because the grass doesn't have as much weed competition. It has a chance to grow in the cooler times of the year to get well established. Now answering your question, if you seed in the fall and you start bale grazing over winter, those plants will be so small they'll be grazed out. Spring seeding, if you can get the seed out when it's still cool and moist, will work. You just don't have as good a chance. But in your case, I would go ahead and try to put seed out in the spring. And in fact, for any of you that have a lot of bare area, if you can get out there and and level things out or get some seed out soon. Not just that quick seeding with annual ryegrass, but get the permanent grasses out. If you can get them out there in early into March and get some soil on top of them, then it'd be worth trying. But the chances of getting a really good establishment before it gets hot, before the weeds start growing, just aren't as good as fall. But you're only out the cost to seed. So, yeah.
What would be your recommendation for a good option if you don't have a no-till seed drill? Like just be on broadcast.
So if you don't have a no-till seed drill, your goal is making sure the seed is covered. And so that would be a light disking, a harrowing, just kind of loosen up the soil, broadcasting, and then dragging. I'd probably bump the seeding rate up because it's not the ideal seeding. Even better than just dragging would be having some kind of roller or cultipacker, like they do in a lawn. You go along and have a little roller there. That's going to push the soil right next to the seed and give a better soil to seed contact. So that'd be what I'd do, yeah. Yeah, you're right. If small ruminants, it's that trampling action can work really well as long as once the grass starts growing, you take them off. Mm-hmm. I'll be around all the way through lunch. I've got to take off right after lunch, so feel free if you've got some individual questions to grab me.